The banker's letter arrived on the worst day of Nora Harrison's life, though she would not know that for several more hours when the sun finally set on her small homestead outside St. Louis, Missouri, in the spring of 1876. She stood on the porch of the cabin her late husband had built with his own hands 3 years before, the official document trembling in her fingers as she read the words that would strip away everything she had left in this world. Foreclosure. The word seemed so cold and final, printed there in neat black ink that contrasted sharply with the cream-colored paper. Her husband Thomas had taken a loan from the First Bank of St. Louis to buy seed and equipment, confident that his crops would pay it back with interest. But Thomas had died 6 months ago when his horse threw him during a storm, and Nora had been struggling ever since to keep the homestead running on her own. The wheat had failed. The chickens had stopped laying in the winter cold. And now, at 24 years old, she was about to lose the only home she had ever truly known as an adult. The letter gave her until the end of the week to vacate the property. 5 days. 5 days to pack up her life and figure out where a widow with no family and no money could possibly go. Nora sank down onto the wooden steps, her dark blonde hair falling loose from its pins as she bent her head and finally allowed herself to cry. The spring wind blew across the fields, carrying with it the scent of wild grass and distant rain. She had tried so hard. Every morning before dawn, she had risen to tend the animals and work the land. She had sold her wedding ring, her mother's silver locket, every possession of value she owned. But it had not been enough. "Madam, you all right there?" The voice startled her so badly that she nearly fell off the step. Nora looked up, using her apron to quickly wipe her eyes, though she knew her face must be blotchy and red from crying. A man stood at the edge of her property, leading a massive brown horse behind him. He was the largest man she had ever seen, easily over 6 feet tall with shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the sun. His hair was dark brown and hung past his collar, and several days' worth of beard covered his strong jaw. He wore buckskin clothing that marked him as someone who spent his time in the wilderness rather than in town. "I'm fine," Nora said, her voice catching despite her best efforts to sound composed. "Just having a difficult day." The man's gray eyes studied her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, as if he could see right through her polite deflection to the desperation underneath. He had the weathered look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors, with lines around his eyes from squinting against the sun. His muscled arms were visible beneath his rolled-up sleeves, and everything about him spoke of raw strength and capability. "Name's Walker Oakes," he said, taking a few steps closer but stopping at a respectful distance. "I was passing through and noticed your fence needs mending on the east side. Thought you might want to know before your livestock gets out." "I don't have much livestock left to get out," Nora said bitterly, then immediately regretted her sharp tone. This stranger was trying to be helpful. "I apologize. That was rude of me." "Thank you for letting me know about the fence, Mr. Oakes. Just Walker is fine." He glanced at the letter still clutched in her hand. "Bad news," Nora hesitated. She did not know this man at all, and proper etiquette dictated that she should not share her personal troubles with a stranger. But something about the genuine concern in his eyes made the words spill out before she could stop them. "The bank is foreclosing on my property. I have 5 days to leave." She gestured helplessly at the cabin behind her. "My husband built this place. We were going to raise our family here, grow old together. But he died and I couldn't keep up with the loan payments, and now I'm losing everything." Walker was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. "Which bank?" "First Bank of St. Louis. The banker's name is Cornelius Blackthorne." Just saying the name left a bitter taste in her mouth. She had gone to see him twice, begging for more time, explaining her situation. He had listened with cold eyes and an even colder smile, then told her that business was business, and sentiment had no place in financial matters. "I know Blackthorne," Walker said, and something dark flickered across his face. "He's foreclosed on half a dozen properties in the past year, sells them for twice what the original loans were worth." "There's nothing I can do about it," Nora said wearily. "I don't have the money to pay what I owe. I've sold everything of value, worked myself to exhaustion, but it's not enough. It's never enough." Walker studied the property, his gaze sweeping across the fields and the cabin and the small barn. "How much do you owe?" $300. It might as well have been 3,000 or 3 million for all the chance she had of coming up with it. "I managed to pay $50 over the winter, but I'm still so far behind that it doesn't matter." $300, Walker repeated slowly. He looked back at her, and Nora felt her cheeks flush under his intense scrutiny. "And if you had that money right now, you could keep your home. The letter says the full amount is due immediately. But even if I could pay it, Mr. Blackthorne made it clear he wants this property. He'll find some other excuse to take it from me eventually." Nora stood up, squaring her shoulders with as much dignity as she could muster. "I appreciate your concern, Mr. Oakes, but there's truly nothing to be done. I'll pack my things and be gone by the end of the week." "Where will you go?" The simple question struck at the heart of her fear. "I don't know. St. Louis, I suppose. I'll try to find work as a seamstress or a cook. Something." Walker's horse nickered softly, and he reached back to pat the animal's neck with one large hand. The gesture was gentle despite his obvious strength, and Nora found herself wondering what kind of man this stranger was. Mountain men had a reputation for being rough and uncivilized, but there was something solid and trustworthy about Walker Oakes. "I'll be in town tomorrow," Walker said finally. "Don't do anything just yet." Before Nora could ask what he meant, he had mounted his horse in one fluid motion and was riding away, heading in the direction of St. Louis. She watched until he disappeared from view, confused and oddly hopeful despite herself. What could a mountain man possibly do about her situation? He was probably just being kind, offering empty comfort to a crying woman. Nora went back inside her cabin and looked around at the life she had built with Thomas. Their bed in the corner, covered with the quilt her grandmother had made. The table where they had shared meals and made plans for the future. The rocking chair Thomas had carved by hand, promising that someday she would sit in it and rock their babies to sleep. She sank into that chair now and let herself remember. Thomas had been a good man, hardworking and optimistic and so full of dreams. He had loved this land with a passion that was almost religious, seeing potential in every acre. When he died, Nora had tried to honor his memory by keeping the homestead going, but the truth was that she did not have his skill or knowledge. She had grown up in a city back east, and farming was still largely a mystery to her despite 3 years of trying to learn. That night, Nora barely slept. She kept thinking about Walker Oakes and the strange promise in his words. Don't do anything just yet. What did that mean? And why did she feel this flutter of something in her chest when she remembered the way he had looked at her, with those storm-gray eyes that seemed to see everything? The next morning dawned clear and bright. Nora fed her remaining chickens and the old milk cow that Thomas had bought from a neighbor. She mended a tear in her second-best dress and tried not to think about the future. Around noon, she heard the sound of horses approaching and went to the window, her heart leaping with hope that she immediately tried to suppress. It was Walker, and he was not alone. Beside him rode a thin man in a dark suit who could only be Cornelius Blackthorne. Nora's stomach dropped. Why had Walker brought the banker here? Was he going to make her humiliation complete by having her evicted early? She stepped out onto the porch, her hands clenched in her apron. Walker dismounted first, and Nora could not help but notice again how powerfully built he was, all muscle and controlled strength. The banker dismounted more carefully, brushing dust from his expensive suit with a look of distaste. "Mrs. Harrison," Blackthorne said with a thin smile that did not reach his eyes, "I understand there has been some confusion about your property." Nora looked between the two men, completely bewildered. "I don't understand." Walker pulled a folded paper from his jacket and handed it to the banker, who accepted it with obvious reluctance. Blackthorne unfolded the document, and Nora watched his expression shift from smugness to shock to barely suppressed anger. "This is highly irregular," Blackthorne said sharply. "But legal," Walker replied, his voice calm but firm. "I've paid the full amount owed on the Harrison property plus the accumulated interest and fees. The debt is satisfied." Nora felt the world tilt sideways. "What? I don't understand. You paid my debt." "The property was about to be seized by the bank," Walker said, turning to look at her directly. "So I bought it. Paid cash for the full amount which Mr. Blackthorne here was required to accept since the funds were available and the debt was legitimate." "You bought my home," Nora said slowly, trying to process what was happening. Relief that she would not be homeless warred with new fear about what this stranger might expect in return. "I don't have any way to pay you back." "That brings us to the second part," Walker said. He pulled another document from his jacket, and this one he held out to Nora directly. "I'm putting the property in your name, free and clear. No debt, no mortgage, no strings attached." Nora took the paper with shaking hands. It was a deed, freshly written, with her name listed as the sole owner of the homestead. She read it 3 times, certain she must be misunderstanding, but the words did not change. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Why would you do this?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Walker said simply. "And because men like Blackthorne have been taking advantage of people for too long." The banker's face had gone red with anger. "This is a legitimate business transaction. Oakes, you cannot simply interfere in matters that don't concern you." "I just did." Walker's voice was soft but carried an edge of steel that made Blackthorne take an involuntary step back. "The property now belongs to Mrs. Harrison. If she chooses to take out another loan in the future, that's her decision, but you won't be foreclosing on this homestead. Ever." "This isn't over," Blackthorne said, jerking his horse's reins. "There are legal channels for complaints about this sort of interference." "Go ahead and pursue them," Walker replied. "I paid fair price for the property and transferred ownership, as is my right. There's nothing illegal about that, no matter how much you wish there was." Blackthorne rode off in a cloud of dust, leaving Nora standing on her porch holding a deed she had never imagined she would see. She looked up at Walker, this stranger who had just given her back her life, and felt tears streaming down her face. "I don't know what to say," she managed. "Thank you doesn't seem like nearly enough. You don't need to say anything." Walker shifted his weight, looking almost uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Like I said, it's the right thing to do. But $300, that's a fortune. How can I ever repay you? You can't, and you don't need to try. The property is yours." He glanced at the cabin, then back at her. "Though I notice you do need some repairs done around here. That fence, for one thing. The barn roof looks like it could use some work before the next big storm. If you'd be willing, I could help with those things." Nora wiped her eyes, trying to compose herself. "You've already done so much. I couldn't ask you to do more work without payment." "I'm not asking for payment. I'm asking if you'd be willing to let me help." Walker's gray eyes held her steadily. "I've been living up in the mountains for the past 5 years, trapping and hunting. It's a lonely life. I wouldn't mind having a reason to stay in one place for a while, and you clearly need assistance with the homestead." I do need help, Nora admitted. I've been trying to manage everything on my own, but the truth is I don't really know what I'm doing. Thomas was the farmer. I was just learning when he died. Then let me help you learn, Walker said. In exchange for some hot meals and maybe a spot in your barn to sleep, I'll help get this place running properly again. It was an unusual arrangement, but these were unusual circumstances. Nora knew she should probably be more cautious about accepting help from a stranger, but Walker had just proven himself to be more trustworthy than most men she had known for years. And the truth was, she desperately needed help if she was going to make the homestead viable. "All right," she said, folding the deed carefully and holding it against her chest like the treasure it was. "You can stay in the barn and I'll make sure you're well fed. And Mr. Oakes, thank you. Truly, you've given me back my life." "Walker," he corrected with a small smile that transformed his rugged face. "And you're welcome, Mrs. Harrison." "Nora," she said, returning his smile. "If we're going to be working together, we should use first names." Walker nodded, then went to tend to his horse. Nora watched him lead the animal toward the barn, still hardly able to believe what had just happened. This morning she had been facing homelessness and despair. Now she owned her property free and clear, and she had helped to get it running again. She went inside and carefully placed the deed in the wooden box where she kept her important papers. Her marriage certificate was there, and the letter from her mother she had received just before her parents died in a fever outbreak back east. Now the deed joined those precious documents, proof that she still had a place in this world. That evening, Nora cooked a proper dinner for the first time in weeks. She had been rationing her supplies carefully, never knowing when she might have money to buy more, but tonight felt like a celebration. She made fried chicken with potatoes and gravy, and even baked a small apple pie using the last of her preserved fruit. When she called Walker in for dinner, he appeared at the cabin door freshly washed, his dark hair wet and slicked back. He had changed into a clean shirt, and Nora found herself noticing details about him she had been too distraught to see before. The strong line of his jaw, the way his shoulders filled the doorway, the calluses on his hands that spoke of hard work and survival. "This looks amazing," Walker said as he sat down at the table. "I haven't had a home-cooked meal like this in longer than I care to remember." "It's the least I can do," Nora replied, serving him generous portions. "You gave me back my home. The least I can do is feed you properly." They ate in comfortable silence for a while. Walker had the manners of someone who had been raised properly, despite his rough appearance, and Nora found herself curious about his story. "You said you've been in the mountains for 5 years, she ventured. "What brought you out here to Missouri?" Walker was quiet for a moment, chewing thoughtfully. "I needed a change. The mountains are beautiful, but after a while the silence gets heavy. I started thinking maybe it was time to be around people again. And you just happened to pass by my homestead." "Not exactly." He met her eyes across the table. "I heard about Blackthorne in town, how he's been buying up properties for pennies on the dollar, taking advantage of people who fall on hard times. I asked around about who he was planning to foreclose on next, and your name came up." Nora set down her fork, stunned. "You came here specifically to help me, but you didn't even know me." "Didn't matter. What he was doing wasn't right, and I had the means to stop it." Walker shrugged his broad shoulders. "I've done well with my trapping over the years. Saved most of what I earned since there's not much to spend money on in the mountains. $300 is a lot to most people, but I could afford it. Seemed like the money could do more good helping you than sitting in a bank account." "Most people wouldn't see it that way," Nora said softly. "Most people would say you made a foolish choice, giving away that much money to a stranger. Then most people and I disagree about what's important in life." Walker returned to his meal, apparently considering the matter closed. Nora studied him as they finished eating. Walker Oakes was unlike any man she had ever met. Her late husband Thomas had been kind and hardworking, but he had also been conventional, always concerned with what the neighbors thought and how things appeared. This man seemed to operate by an entirely different code, one based on his own sense of right and wrong rather than society's expectations. After dinner, Walker insisted on helping clean up despite Nora's protests. They worked side by side in the small kitchen, and Nora found herself acutely aware of his presence. He was so large that he made the cabin feel smaller, but it was not an unpleasant feeling. If anything, having him there made the space feel safer, more protected. "I'll start on that fence first thing tomorrow," Walker said as he dried the last plate. "Then I'll take a look at the barn roof and see what supplies we'll need for repairs." "I should warn you, I don't have much money for supplies," Nora admitted. "I sold almost everything to try to make the loan payments. We'll figure it out. There's plenty of lumber in your woodlot that just needs cutting and treating, and I can trade for what we can't make ourselves." He hung the dish towel on its hook and turned to face her. "This homestead has good bones, Nora. With some work, it can be prosperous again." The way he said her name in that deep voice of his made something flutter in her chest. Nora quickly looked away, suddenly flustered. She was a widow still in mourning. She had no business noticing how handsome Walker looked in the lamplight or how safe she felt with him near. "I should let you get some rest," she said, moving toward the door. "The barn should be comfortable enough. There are extra blankets in the chest if you need them." "I'll be fine. I've slept in much worse places than a barn." Walker paused at the door, looking down at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Sleep well, Nora. Tomorrow's a new start for both of us." After he left, Nora prepared for bed in a daze. Everything had changed so quickly. This morning she had been facing destitution, and now she owned her property free and clear and had helped to make it successful. It seemed like a dream, but the deed in her document box was real enough. She climbed into bed and lay awake for a long time, listening to the familiar sounds of the homestead at night. Somewhere out in the barn, Walker was settling down to sleep. The thought of having him nearby was comforting in a way she had not expected. For the first time since Thomas died, she did not feel completely alone. The next morning, Nora woke to the sound of hammering. She dressed quickly and went outside to find Walker already hard at work on the fence. He had removed his shirt in the warming morning sun, and Nora found herself stopping short at the sight of him. His back and arms were heavily muscled from years of hard labor, his skin tanned from constant exposure to the elements. He moved with efficient grace, driving posts into the ground with powerful swings of a sledgehammer. "You're up early," Nora called out, trying to keep her voice steady. Walker turned, and she saw a sheen of sweat on his chest and shoulders. "Habit from mountain living. You wake with the sun up there, or you waste half the day. I'll bring you some water and breakfast." "Much appreciated." Nora went back inside, her heart beating faster than it should. She told herself firmly that she was simply grateful for his help, that the fluttering in her stomach had nothing to do with the way his muscles moved when he worked or how his gray eyes seemed to see straight into her soul. She was a widow, a respectable woman. She had no business having such thoughts, but as the days passed, Nora found it increasingly difficult to maintain that stance. Walker worked tirelessly on the homestead, repairing the fence, fixing the barn roof, even plowing the fields and showing her the proper way to plant crops. He was patient and knowledgeable, teaching her everything she needed to know without making her feel foolish for not knowing it already. More than that, he was easy to talk to. In the evenings after work, They would sit on the porch and share stories about their lives. Walker told her about growing up on a farm in Kentucky, about losing his parents to cholera when he was 18, about heading west to find a new life and ending up in the mountains living off the land. "Why did you stay so long in the mountains?" Nora asked one evening as they watched the sun set over the fields. "Didn't you get lonely?" "Lonely is relative," Walker said, whittling a piece of wood with steady hands. "I was alone, sure, but I was also free. No expectations, no one depending on me, no one to disappoint. After my parents died, I felt like I had failed them somehow. Like if I had been smarter or faster or better, I could have saved them. The mountains let me escape from that feeling." "But you can't really escape your feelings," Nora said softly. "They follow you wherever you go." "You're right about that." Walker looked at her, his eyes reflecting the dying light. "But sometimes you need distance before you can face them properly. The mountains gave me that distance. Now I think I'm ready to be around people again, to have a purpose beyond just surviving day to day." "Is that what this is? Your purpose?" "Maybe. Or maybe it's just the beginning of figuring out what my purpose is." He returned his attention to his whittling. "What about you? Did you always want to be a farmer's wife?" Nora laughed softly. "No, I grew up in Philadelphia. My parents owned a dry goods store. I thought I would marry a clerk or a shopkeeper, live in the city my whole life. Then I met Thomas at a church social. He was visiting from Missouri, and he had such grand dreams about building a life out west. He was so passionate about it that I got caught up in his vision." "Did you love him?" The question was direct but not unkind. Nora considered it carefully. "I cared for him deeply. He was a good man, and I was happy with him. But if I'm being honest, I was more in love with the idea of adventure than I was with Thomas himself. When we first came here, everything was exciting and new. Then reality set in, and I realized how hard this life really is." "Do you regret it?" "No," Nora said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Even with everything that's happened, I don't regret coming here. This land has taught me things about myself I never would have learned in Philadelphia. I'm stronger than I thought I was, more capable. And I'm not ready to give up on this life yet." Walker smiled at her, and Nora felt warmth spread through her chest. "You are strong," he said. "You've been managing this place on your own for months. That takes courage and determination." "I was barely managing. If you hadn't come along, I would have lost everything. But you didn't give up. That matters more than you think." As spring turned into early summer, the homestead began to transform. The fields were planted with wheat and corn. The vegetable garden Nora had struggled to maintain was now thriving under Walker's care. The barn had a new roof, the fences were solid, and Walker had even built a new chicken coop that was already housing twice as many birds as Nora had owned before. More than the physical improvements, though, Nora found herself transforming internally. The despair and fear that had been her constant companions since Thomas died had faded, replaced by something she was afraid to name. She looked forward to seeing Walker every morning. She found excuses to bring him water or food while he worked, just to have a few minutes of conversation. She lay awake at night in her cabin, thinking about him in the barn and wishing things could be different. Because the truth was, Nora was falling in love with Walker Oakes. She tried to tell herself it was too soon, that she was still in mourning, that she barely knew him. But her heart refused to listen to logic. Every day she spent with him, she discovered new things to admire: his kindness to the animals, the way he never lost his patience when teaching her, his quiet strength and the sense of safety she felt in his presence. One evening in late June, a storm rolled in from the west. Nora could see the dark clouds building all afternoon, and by dinner time the wind had picked up significantly. She made a simple meal of soup and bread, and when she called Walker in, she could see the concern on his face. "This is going to be a bad one," he said, glancing out the window at the darkening sky. "I should check that all the animals are secure before it hits. I'll come help you." They worked quickly, making sure the chickens were in their coop, the cow was in the barn, and everything that could blow away was tied down or brought inside. By the time they finished, the first drops of rain were falling, fat and heavy. "You should get back to the cabin," Walker said, having to raise his voice to be heard over the wind. "I'll be fine in the barn." "The barn isn't safe in a storm like this," Nora protested. "That roof is new, but we don't know how it will hold up in heavy weather. You should come inside." Walker hesitated, and Nora could see the internal debate playing out on his face. It would not be proper for him to spend the night in her cabin, even with a storm raging. But safety had to take precedence over propriety. "Please," Nora said, touching his arm. "I'll worry about you if you stay out here." That seemed to decide him. "All right, but just until the storm passes." They ran for the cabin as the rain began in earnest, reaching the door just as the sky opened up completely. Inside, Nora lit extra lamps against the growing darkness while Walker barred the door against the wind. Thunder rumbled overhead, growing louder with each peal. "I haven't seen a storm like this since I left Kentucky," Walker said, watching through the window as lightning split the sky. "We're in for a rough night." Nora ladled out bowls of soup, and they ate watching the storm. The wind howled around the cabin, making the walls creak, and rain lashed against the windows. It would have been frightening if Walker had not been there, but his presence made even the fury of the storm feel manageable. After they ate, Walker insisted on taking the rocking chair while Nora sat on the bed. It was the only proper arrangement given the circumstances, though Nora could not help but notice how uncomfortable he looked trying to fit his large frame into the chair. "You should take the bed," she said. "You've been working hard all day. The least I can do is let you sleep comfortably." "I'm not taking your bed, Nora. The chair is fine. Don't be stubborn. The bed is big enough for both of us if we're sensible about it. We can put pillows down the middle if it makes you feel better." Walker looked at her with an expression she could not read. "That wouldn't be proper." "Proper went out the window when I invited you to stay in my cabin during a storm," Nora replied, then immediately blushed at her own forwardness. "I just mean that we're both adults. We can share a bed for sleeping purposes without it meaning anything improper. And you'll be useless for work tomorrow if you spend the whole night folded up in that chair." After a long moment, Walker nodded. "All right, but I'll sleep on top of the blankets." They arranged themselves on opposite sides of the bed, a line of pillows between them as promised. Nora tried to relax, but she was intensely aware of Walker's presence just inches away. She could hear his breathing, slow and steady, could feel the warmth radiating from his body. The intimacy of the situation made her heart race. Outside, the storm raged on. Thunder shook the cabin, and the wind sounded like a living thing trying to tear the walls apart. Nora found herself scooting closer to the center of the bed, seeking comfort from the man beside her. "Are you all right?" Walker's voice came soft through the darkness. "Just frightened of the storm." "I've never liked thunder. Come here." Walker moved the pillows between them and held out his arm. After only a moment's hesitation, Nora moved closer, resting her head on his broad chest. His arm came around her, strong and protective, and she felt the tension drain from her body. "You're safe," Walker murmured. "I won't let anything happen to you." Nora believed him. With her ear pressed against his chest, she could hear the strong, steady beat of his heart. His hand gently stroked her hair, the touch soothing and gentle despite his obvious strength. "Walker." She whispered, "Yes, I'm glad you came here. I'm glad you saved my home, but more than that, I'm glad I met you." His arm tightened around her slightly. "I'm glad I met you too, Nora, more glad than you know." They lay together listening to the storm, and somewhere in the darkness and the warmth of his embrace, Nora drifted off to sleep. She woke once in the night to find that she had curled completely against Walker's side, and his arms were wrapped around her, as if even in sleep he was protecting her. She should have moved away, returned to her side of the bed, but instead she let herself enjoy the feeling of being held, of being cherished. When morning came, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean and bright. Nora woke to find herself alone in the bed, but she could hear Walker moving around in the cabin. She sat up, her hair falling loose around her shoulders, and found him standing by the window looking out at the morning. "Did the homestead fare all right?" she asked, her voice still rough with sleep. Walker turned, and something in his expression made her breath catch. He looked at her like she was something precious and fragile and infinitely valuable. "Everything's fine. Better than fine." He crossed to the bed and knelt beside it, bringing himself to her eye level. "Nora, we need to talk about last night." "Nothing happened," she said quickly, though her cheeks flushed. "We just slept. It was completely innocent, I know, but the way I feel about you isn't innocent anymore." Walker took her hand in both of his calloused palms warm and rough. "I came here to help you, and I told myself that was all it was. A good deed, a way to use my money for something worthwhile, but that's not true anymore. Maybe it was never true." "What are you saying?" Nora's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "I'm saying I've fallen in love with you. I know it's too soon. I know you're still mourning your husband. I know I should keep these feelings to myself and just continue being your friend. But after holding you last night, after feeling you in my arms, I can't pretend anymore." Walker's gray eyes were intense, filled with emotion. "I love you, Nora Harrison, and if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy." Tears spilled down Nora's cheeks, but they were tears of joy. "I love you too. I've been trying not to, telling myself it was too soon, that I was being foolish. But I can't help it. You've brought light back into my life. You've given me hope and happiness when I thought I would never feel those things again." Walker cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently wiping away her tears. "Are you sure? I don't want you to feel obligated because of what I did for you. This has nothing to do with obligation. I love you for who you are, for your kindness and strength and the way you see the best in people. I love the way you work with your hands and the way you're patient when teaching me. I love your smile and your laugh and the way you make me feel safe." Nora placed her hands over his. "I love you, Walker Oakes, and I want you to stay, not in the barn, but here, with me. As my husband, if you'll have me." The smile that broke across Walker's face was like the sun coming out after a storm. He leaned forward and kissed her, gentle at first, then deeper as she responded. His hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer, and Nora wrapped her arms around his neck, losing herself in the feeling of finally being where she belonged. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Walker rested his forehead against hers. "I'll marry you tomorrow if you'll let me. Today if we can find a preacher." Nora laughed, the sound full of pure happiness. "Let's give it at least a few weeks. I want to make a proper dress and we should have a real celebration. After everything we've been through, we deserve that much." "We deserve everything," Walker said fiercely. "And I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you have it." They planned the wedding for the end of July, which gave them just over a month to prepare. Walker rode into St. Louis to arrange for a preacher, and while he was there, he stopped by the bank. Nora did not know this until he returned, but when he told her about his visit, she could not help but smile. "Blackthorne tried to make trouble," Walker explained that evening. Said he was going to report me for improper business practices. So I reminded him that I had simply purchased a property and transferred ownership, which is completely legal. Then I mentioned that it would be a shame if word got around town about how he targets widows and struggling families for foreclosure. What did he say to that? Turned red as a beet and told me to get out of his office, but I don't think he'll be causing us any more problems. Walker pulled Nora into his arms, something he did frequently now that they were engaged. I also bought you something while I was in town. He pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple gold wedding band. I know it's not fancy, but I wanted you to have something nice. Nora's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the ring. It's perfect. Everything about this is perfect. The weeks leading up to the wedding were some of the happiest of Nora's life. She made herself a new dress from fabric Walker bought in town, pale blue cotton with white lace at the collar and cuffs. Walker built new furniture for the cabin, including a larger bed and a proper dining table with chairs. They worked together on the homestead, and every day Nora learned something new, becoming more confident in her abilities. Word spread about their upcoming wedding, and neighbors Nora had rarely spoken to began stopping by with gifts and congratulations. She learned that many of them had been in similar situations to hers, struggling to make their homestead successful, living in fear of the bank. Walker's actions had given them hope that someone was willing to stand up to men like Blackthorne. On a warm Saturday in late July, they were married in front of the cabin, surrounded by neighbors and new friends. The preacher from St. Louis performed the ceremony, his voice carrying across the fields as he spoke about love and commitment and building a life together. When Walker slipped the gold band onto Nora's finger and kissed her as his wife, she felt a completeness she had never experienced before. The celebration went late into the evening, with music and dancing and more food than Nora had seen since before Thomas died. But the best moment came after everyone had gone home, when Walker carried her over the threshold of the cabin and set her down gently in their home. "Hello, wife," he said with a smile that made her heart flutter. "Hello, husband," Nora replied, reaching up to touch his face. "I love you. I love you too, more than I ever thought possible." Their wedding night was tender and passionate, Walker gentle and patient as he showed Nora depths of feeling she had never known. Afterwards, they lay tangled together in their bed, the summer breeze drifting through the open window, and Nora felt such overwhelming happiness that she almost could not believe it was real. "What are you thinking?" Walker asked, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her shoulder. "I'm thinking about how different my life is now compared to a few months ago. When you first showed up, I thought I had lost everything. Now I have more than I ever dreamed possible. We both do." Walker kissed the top of her head, "And this is just the beginning. We have our whole lives ahead of us." As summer turned to fall, Walker and Nora settled into married life. The homestead thrived under their combined efforts. The crops came in better than expected, and they were able to sell enough wheat and corn to have money for the winter and beyond. Walker used some of the profits to buy more chickens and 2 pigs, expanding their livestock. In October, Nora realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but wanted to be certain before she told Walker. When she finally shared the news one evening after dinner, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy, then immediately set her down carefully as if she might break. "Are you sure?" he asked, his hand coming to rest on her still flat stomach. "As sure as I can be. I think the baby will come in late spring." Walker pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "I'm going to be a father. We're going to have a family." "We already are a family," Nora said, wrapping her arms around his waist. "But yes, Soon there will be 3 of us." Walker became even more protective after learning about the baby. He insisted on doing all the heavy work around the homestead and constantly checked to make sure Nora was not overdoing it. She found his concern endearing, even when it occasionally bordered on excessive. Winter came, but it was nothing like the previous winter Nora had endured alone. With Walker beside her and plenty of supplies laid in, the cold months felt cozy rather than threatening. They spent long evenings by the fire, Walker reading aloud from the books he had bought in town while Nora sewed baby clothes and blankets. "What should we name the baby?" Nora asked one snowy evening in January. Walker considered the question seriously. "If it's a boy, maybe William, after my father." "What was your father's name?" "Henry. William Henry Oakes. That has a nice sound to it." "And if it's a girl?" "I've always liked the name Sarah. Sarah Rose Oakes." "Sarah Rose," Walker repeated, testing the name. "I like that. Though truthfully, I'll be happy with whatever name you choose and whatever we have as long as you and the baby are healthy." As winter gave way to early spring, Nora's belly grew round with their child. She felt the baby move for the first time in March, a flutter like butterfly wings that made her gasp with wonder. She grabbed Walker's hand and placed it on her stomach, and moments later he felt it too. "That's our baby," he said in awe. "That's our child in there." "Our child," Nora agreed, covering his hand with hers. "The first of many, I hope." "As many as you want to give me," Walker promised. In late May, on a bright morning when the fields were green with new growth, Nora went into labor. Walker had brought a midwife from St. Louis to stay with them for the last few weeks, and the older woman took charge immediately, sending Walker out of the cabin despite his protests. "This is women's work," the midwife said firmly. "You go chop wood or mend fence or do something useful while I help your wife bring this baby into the world." Walker looked to Nora, who nodded despite the contraction gripping her body. "I'll be fine. Go." The labor lasted most of the day. Outside, Walker wore a path in the dirt from pacing, starting toward the cabin door every time he heard a sound from inside. Finally, as the sun was setting, he heard the thin wail of a newborn baby and could not stop himself from rushing to the door. The midwife opened it with a tired but happy smile. "You have a son, Mr. Oakes, a healthy boy with good lungs." Walker entered the cabin to find Nora propped up in bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she had sewn. She looked up at him with tears of joy on her cheeks. "Come meet your son," she said softly. Walker crossed to the bed and looked down at the baby for the first time. The infant had a cap of dark hair and a red, wrinkled face, his tiny fists waving in the air. As Walker watched, the baby's eyes opened briefly, revealing the same gray color as his father's. "He's perfect," Walker breathed. "You're perfect. Thank you for this gift." "William Henry Oakes," Nora said, gently touching the baby's cheek. "Welcome to the world, little one." Walker sat on the edge of the bed, putting his arm around Nora's shoulders and looking down at their son. "I never knew I could feel this much love. It's almost overwhelming." "I know," Nora agreed, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I feel like my heart might burst from it." The first few weeks with baby William were exhausting but wonderful. Walker was an attentive father, getting up with Nora for nighttime feedings, changing diapers without complaint, and spending hours just watching his son sleep. Nora often found him in the rocking chair he had made, cradling William and singing softly in a deep voice that seemed to soothe the baby instantly. As summer progressed, they established a new rhythm to their life that included caring for their son along with running the homestead. Neighbors stopped by to meet the baby and offer congratulations, and Nora realized she had built a real community here. These people were her friends now, not just distant acquaintances. One evening in late summer, after William had been put to bed in the cradle Walker had carved, Nora and Walker sat on the porch watching the sunset. Nora leaned against her husband's shoulder, content and happy. "You ever miss the mountains?" she asked. Walker was quiet for a moment, then shook his head. "No, everything I need is right here. You, William, this homestead. This is where I belong. I'm glad, because I don't think I could bear to be without you now. You'll never have to find out." Walker kissed her forehead. "I'm yours for as long as we both shall live. That's a promise I intend to keep." The years that followed were filled with hard work, deep love, and growing happiness. When William was 2 years old, Nora gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah Rose, just as they had planned. 2 years after that, another son arrived, whom they named Thomas after Nora's first husband, honoring the man whose dreams had first brought her to this land. The homestead prospered under Walker's management and Nora's increasingly skilled help. They bought more land, expanded their livestock, and became known throughout the area for their quality crops and fair dealings. But more important than the material success was the family they built together. On summer evenings, Walker would play with the children in the yard while Nora prepared dinner, and she would pause to watch them, her heart full. William had his father's gray eyes and strong build, already showing promise of the man he would become. Sarah was quick and clever, always asking questions about everything she saw. Little Thomas was the sweetest-natured of the three, content to sit in his mother's lap and listen to stories. In the fall of 1883, 7 years after Walker had first appeared at Nora's homestead, they held a celebration to mark the anniversary of their meeting. Friends and neighbors came from miles around for a harvest feast, and as Nora looked around at the full table and happy faces, she marveled at how much her life had changed. That night, after everyone had gone and the children were asleep, Walker and Nora walked hand in hand through their fields under a full moon. "You remember the first time I saw you?" Walker asked. "You were sitting on those porch steps crying, holding that foreclosure letter." "I remember thinking you were the biggest man I had ever seen," Nora replied with a smile, "and wondering why a complete stranger was asking if I was all right. I took one look at you and something just clicked into place. I didn't understand it then, but I think even in that moment I knew you were going to be important to me." Nora squeezed his hand. "You gave me back my life that day. But more than that, you gave me love and family and happiness I never expected to find." "We gave each other those things," Walker corrected. "You showed me what it means to build something lasting, to put down roots and be part of something bigger than yourself. Before I met you, I was just drifting through life. You gave me purpose." They stopped in the middle of the wheat field, the stalks rustling gently around them in the night breeze. Walker pulled Nora into his arms, and she rested her head against his broad chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you," she said simply. "More now than I did the day we married, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today. And I'll spend every tomorrow making sure you never regret choosing me," Walker promised. They stood together in the moonlight, two people who had found each other when they both needed saving. The banker had tried to take Nora's home, but Walker had given it back along with so much more. He had given her himself, his heart, his strength, his unwavering support, and she had given him a reason to leave the lonely mountains and build a life of meaning and connection. The homestead that had almost been lost to foreclosure now rang with the laughter of children and the quiet contentment of a couple deeply in love. The fields that Nora had once struggled to maintain alone now flourished under their combined care. The cabin that had seemed so empty after Thomas's death was now filled with life and warmth and the constant presence of family. As they walked back toward the house, Walker's arm around Nora's shoulders and her arm around his waist, they could see lamplight glowing in the windows. Home. Not just a building or a piece of property, but a place where they belonged together, where they had built something real and lasting, where their children would grow and eventually build their own lives. Nora thought about the desperate woman she had been 7 years ago, certain that her life was over, that she had nothing left to hope for. She wished she could go back and tell that woman not to despair. That help was coming in the form of a mountain man with gray eyes and a generous heart. That the worst day of her life was actually the beginning of the best years. But perhaps it was better not to know the future. The surprise of finding love when she had given up on it. The joy of watching Walker transform from a stranger to a husband to a father. The steady accumulation of small, happy moments that built into a beautiful life. All of it had been sweeter for being unexpected. As they reached the porch, Walker paused to kiss his wife under the stars. 7 years of marriage had not diminished the spark between them. If anything, it had grown stronger, deepened by shared experiences and weathered hardships and the everyday intimacy of building a life together. "Thank you," Nora whispered against his lips. "For what? For seeing me that day. For stopping to ask if I was all right. For caring enough to help a stranger." Walker smiled, that slow smile she loved so much. "Best decision I ever made. Though if I'm being honest, I don't think I ever really had a choice. Something in me recognized something in you, and after that, there was nowhere else I could go." They went inside together, checking on each sleeping child before retiring to their own bed. Nora curled against Walker's side, his arm around her, their bodies fitting together in the familiar way of long practice. "What do you think the children will do when they grow up?" Nora mused sleepily. "Whatever they want," Walker replied. "We'll make sure they have choices we didn't have. Education, opportunities, the freedom to follow their own dreams. But I hope at least one of them stays here and keeps the homestead going. It would be nice to have grandchildren playing in these fields someday." "Grandchildren," Walker repeated, sounding simultaneously pleased and alarmed. "We're too young to be thinking about grandchildren already." Nora laughed softly. "Maybe, but time moves faster than you think. Before we know it, William will be grown and starting his own family. Then we'll enjoy every moment we have while they're still young," Walker said firmly. "No rushing through the good times." As Nora drifted off to sleep, safe and warm in her husband's arms, she sent up a silent prayer of gratitude for the unexpected blessings that had come into her life. For the strength to endure hard times, for the stranger who had become her everything, for the children who filled her days with purpose and joy, for the land that sustained them and the community that supported them. The years continued to pass in their pleasant rhythm. William grew tall and strong like his father, taking naturally to the work of the homestead. He had Walker's quiet competence and Nora's compassionate heart, and she knew he would be a fine man. Sarah proved to be as bright as she was beautiful, reading every book she could get her hands on and asking questions that sometimes stumped even her well-educated mother. Thomas remained the gentle soul of the family, more interested in tending the animals than working the fields, showing a natural gift for healing that made Nora wonder if he might become a doctor someday. When William turned 16, Walker took him into St. Louis to teach him about managing money and conducting business. They stopped by the bank, though it was no longer run by Cornelius Blackthorne. The man had left town several years earlier after being investigated for improper business practices, and the new banker was a fair-minded man who treated his customers with respect. "Your father did a very brave thing when he stood up to the previous banker," the new banker told William during their visit. "He didn't just save your mother's homestead. He made it clear that people around here wouldn't tolerate that kind of exploitation anymore. You should be proud of him. William looked at Walker with obvious admiration. I am proud of him. He's the best man I know. On the ride home, Walker was unusually quiet. Finally, William asked him what he was thinking about. Just remembering the day I first came to your mother's homestead, Walker said. I had no idea that stopping to help a crying woman would change my entire life. But that's how the most important things happen, I think. Small choices that lead to big consequences. Do you ever wish you had stayed in the mountains? William asked. Not even for a moment. Walker's answer was immediate and certain. The mountains were where I went to hide from life. Your mother and you children are where I learned to live it fully. That evening, Walker recounted the conversation to Nora while they prepared dinner together. The children were old enough now to handle many of the chores themselves, which gave the couple more time alone than they had enjoyed in years. He asked if I missed the mountains, Walker said, cutting vegetables for the stew. And I realized I barely even think about that time anymore. It feels like a different life that happened to a different person. You were a different person, Nora replied, stirring the pot on the stove. Lonelier, more isolated. Coming here changed you. You changed me. You made me want to be part of the world again instead of hiding from it. Nora set down her spoon and crossed to her husband, wrapping her arms around him from behind. At nearly 40 years old, she still felt the same flutter in her chest when he touched her that she had experienced as a young widow falling in love. Some things she had learned only grew stronger with time. We changed each other, she said, resting her cheek against his broad back. I was so lost when you found me. You gave me back my strength. Walker turned in her arms and kissed her deeply, the kind of kiss that still made her knees weak after all these years. They broke apart when they heard the children coming in from their chores, but the promise in Walker's eyes told Nora they would continue this conversation later in private. Dinner was a lively affair, as it always was with 3 growing children. Sarah was full of excitement about a new book she had gotten from a traveling merchant, while Thomas described in detail the calf that had been born that morning. William was quieter, clearly still processing his trip to St. Louis and the stories he had heard about his father's past. After the children had gone to bed, Walker and Nora sat on the porch in the rocking chairs they had used for nearly 15 years. The night was warm and clear, filled with the sounds of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. "You think William is all right?" Nora asked. "He seemed thoughtful at dinner. He's just growing up." Learning that his parents are real people with histories and complications, not just the folks who tell him to do his chores. Walker reached over and took Nora's hand. "He's a good boy. He'll be a good man. They're all good children. We're very lucky. Luck had nothing to do with it. We gave them love and stability and good examples. They're turning out well because of the home we built for them." Nora squeezed his hand, then stood and moved to sit in his lap, something she still did even though she was no longer the young woman he had married. Walker's arms came around her automatically, and she nestled against his chest. "You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that day?" she asked. "If you had just ridden past my homestead without checking on me, sometimes, but it's not a thought I like to linger on." Walker's arms tightened around her. "I can't imagine my life without you in it. Don't want to imagine it. Neither can I. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, Walker Oakes. The feeling is entirely mutual, Nora Oakes." They sat together under the stars, content in the life they had built and the love they shared. Inside the cabin, their children slept safely. Around them, the homestead stood prosperous and peaceful. And in their hearts, the certainty that they had found something rare and precious. A love that had transformed both their lives and given them a future neither could have imagined alone. As the years continued forward, that love only deepened. Sarah eventually went east to attend a women's college, returning with a teaching certificate and a passion for education. She married a schoolteacher from St. Louis and moved to town, though she visited the homestead frequently with her own children. Thomas, as Nora had suspected, pursued medicine, becoming a doctor who served the rural communities around St. Louis with skill and compassion. William stayed on the homestead, just as Nora had hoped. He married a farmer's daughter from a neighboring property and began to take over the day-to-day management of the land from his aging father. Walker, now in his 50s, was happy to step back and let his son handle the heavy work, though he still contributed his knowledge and experience. On a warm summer evening when Nora was 52 and Walker was 54, they sat on their porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard. William's 3 boys ran through the fields with the boundless energy of youth, while Sarah's 2 daughters picked wildflowers nearby. Thomas's infant son slept in Nora's arms, a peaceful weight against her chest. 5 grandchildren, Walker said with a note of wonder in his voice. And Thomas says his wife is expecting again. We're blessed beyond measure, Nora replied, gently rocking the sleeping baby. Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life. It seems too good to be true. It's true because we made it true, because we chose each other and chose to build something lasting. Walker reached over and tucked a strand of gray threaded hair behind Nora's ear. You're still the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. You're just saying that because your eyesight is going, Nora teased, though her cheeks flushed with pleasure at the compliment. My eyesight is perfect. And even if it wasn't, I would still see you exactly as you are, the love of my life, the mother of my children, the woman who made everything possible. Nora looked at her husband, this man who had given her back her life and then filled it with more joy than she had ever thought possible. His hair was completely gray now, and there were deep lines around his eyes and mouth, but he was still the strongest, most capable man she knew. Still her protector and partner and best friend. I love you, she said, the same words she had spoken countless times over the years but which never lost their meaning. Thank you for stopping that day. Thank you for seeing me and caring and choosing to help. Thank you for every day since. Thank you for letting me stay, Walker replied. For seeing past the rough exterior to the man underneath. For giving me a home and a family and a reason to be better than I was. As the sun set over their fields and their grandchildren's laughter filled the air, Nora and Walker Oakes sat together, surrounded by the abundant evidence of a life well lived. The homestead that had almost been lost to foreclosure now teemed with life and love and the promise of future generations. The banker who had tried to take it had been forgotten, but the mountain man who had saved it and the widow who had captured his heart would be remembered by their descendants for generations to come. This was not just a house or a piece of property. It was a legacy of love, built on a foundation of kindness and courage. It was proof that one person's compassion could change everything, that the worst moments could lead to the best outcomes. That love, when it came, could transform not just 2 lives but countless lives stretching into the future. As darkness fell and the children were called inside, Walker helped Nora to her feet, both of them moving a bit more slowly than they once had but still strong, still together, still deeply in love. They walked into their home hand in hand, just as they had done thousands of times before, grateful for the past, content with the present, and secure in the knowledge that their love would endure whatever the future might bring. The story that had begun with a desperate woman and a kind stranger had become a tale of enduring love, family, and the power of choosing compassion over indifference. and every person who lived on that homestead in the years that followed would know that they stood on ground sanctified by the truest kind of love, the kind that gives without expecting return, that chooses to stay through hardship, that builds something beautiful from the wreckage of loss. The kind of love that saves lives and creates legacies and proves, beyond any doubt, that one moment of kindness can echo through eternity.